Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into something that'll make you grateful for every modern hospital visit you've ever had. We're talking about medieval hospitals, and trust me, these weren't places you went to get better. They were places you went to suffer, share diseases, and quite possibly die in ways that would make your worst nightmare seem like a pleasant dream. So grab something comforting, maybe dim the lights, and let's step back into a world where medicine was more like organized torture, and hospitals were basically death factories with religious decorations. Before we begin this journey into medieval medical horror, take a moment to like this video if you're ready to have your perspective on healthcare completely shattered. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's brave enough to join us for these darker chapters of human history. Picture this. You're living in medieval Europe, maybe the 13th century. You've got a fever, a nasty wound, or perhaps you're a woman about to give birth. Where do you go? Well, if you're lucky enough to live near a city, there might be a hospital. But here's the thing that'll chill you to the bone. Walking into a medieval hospital was often signing your own death warrant. These institutions had mortality rates that would make a battlefield look safe. We're talking about 1 in 5 people who entered never walking back out. 1 in 5. Let that sink in for a moment. Now you might be thinking, surely it couldn't have been that bad. Surely these were places of healing, run by religious orders with good intentions. And you'd be partially right about the intentions. But the road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions. And medieval hospitals were quite literally paved with the bodies of those good intentions couldn't save. Let's start with the most famous example, the Hôtel Dieu in Paris. This place was legendary, and not in a good way. By the 18th century, it was described as the largest, the most numerous, the richest, and the most dreadful of any of our hospitals. Dreadful. That's not exactly the kind of review you want for a place that's supposed to make you better. The mortality rate at this particular hospital was almost 25%, significantly higher than other Parisian hospitals. But even those numbers don't tell the full story of the horror that awaited patients inside these walls. The overcrowding at the Hôtel Dieu was absolutely staggering. Picture this nightmare scenario. The hospital had 1,200 beds. Sounds reasonable, right? Wrong. Those 1,200 beds were expected to house an average of 3,500 patients every single day. The mathematics of misery don't lie. That's nearly 3 people per bed. And during epidemics or times of war, those numbers would skyrocket to over 1,500 patients crammed into spaces meant for far fewer. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. These beds weren't spacious hospital beds like we know today. They were narrow, measuring just about 4 feet wide. And into each of these beds, they would cram 2, 3, sometimes even 6 people. Imagine lying there burning with fever, while strangers with unknown diseases are pressed against you on all sides. You might have come in with a broken bone and leave with the plague. If you left at all, the arrangement was heel to head, meaning your feet might be next to someone's face, and their feet next to yours. During the Napoleonic era, conditions became even more desperate. 6 people to a bed was not uncommon. And here's a detail that'll make your skin crawl. Pregnant women often had to share beds while giving birth. Let that image settle in your mind. Women in labor, the most vulnerable moment of their lives, sharing cramped spaces with strangers who might be dying from any number of diseases. The physical environment was a nightmare beyond imagination. These vast halls held 80 to 100 beds each. Although they had fireplaces or stoves, lighting them was almost impossible. So picture these enormous chambers, filled with the groans and cries of the sick and dying, shrouded in cold and darkness. The smell alone would have been overwhelming. With no understanding of hygiene or sanitation, these places reeked of human waste, infection, and death. The staffing situation was equally horrific and reveals just how little medical care these patients actually received. By the 1700s, there were just 8 physicians on staff to care for all these patients. 8 doctors for thousands of people. Each physician was required to visit patients twice a week, which means when the hospital was at capacity, each doctor was responsible for about 430 patients. Think about that for a moment. How much individual attention could each patient possibly receive? How could any doctor properly diagnose or treat anyone under those conditions? Now, you might be wondering about the nurses or other medical staff. There were roughly 100 surgeons as well, but remember, medieval surgery was a completely different beast than modern surgery. These weren't skilled medical professionals in the way we understand them today. Many were barbers, butchers, or other tradespeople who performed medical procedures on the side. They had no understanding of germs, no concept of sterilization, and no anesthesia to offer patients. The concept of infection control was completely foreign to medieval medical thinking. There was no knowledge of germs, no understanding of how diseases spread from person to person. The very practices that we now know prevent infection were not just unknown, they were often the opposite of what was actually happening. Instruments used in operations were never sterilized. Why would they be? No one understood that dirty instruments could carry disease from one patient to another. The surgical conditions were nothing short of barbaric. Operations were performed by people with no formal medical training. Remember, many of these so-called surgeons were butchers and barbers in their regular jobs. They would use the same tools and techniques they used on animals, or for cutting hair on human patients who were fully conscious and in excruciating pain. Post-operative infections were not just common, they were expected. Most patients who underwent any procedure involving a deep cut through the skin faced a very real possibility of death, but the horror wasn't limited to surgery. The basic understanding of human anatomy was so poor that treatments often caused more harm than the original ailment. Medieval physicians believed in the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They thought that illness was caused by an imbalance of these humours, and the solution was often to purge the body of excess through bleeding, cupping, or leeching. Bloodletting was perhaps the most common and dangerous procedure performed in medieval hospitals. Practitioners would nick veins or arteries, usually in the forearm or neck, using a tool called a phleem, which was essentially a brass contraption with multiple steel blades of varying sizes. The amount of blood they would drain from patients was staggering. This practice didn't just fail to cure diseases, it actively weakened patients, making them more susceptible to infection and other complications. The phleem wasn't the only tool of medical torture. Leeches were considered the premium option for bloodletting. These slimy creatures were so popular that France imported about 40 million leeches annually in the 1830s. European leeches were apparently superior to their American counterparts, capable of extracting several times more blood. Patients would lie there, conscious and helpless, while these creatures attached themselves and slowly drained their blood. But bloodletting was just the beginning of the medical horrors that awaited patients. Medieval doctors had some truly bizarre diagnostic methods. They would literally taste and smell patients' urine to make medical diagnoses. Doctors would examine urine using special flasks and colour charts, and yes, they would actually taste it to determine what was wrong with the patient. Imagine being so desperate for medical care that you'd allow someone to taste your bodily fluids and call it professional healthcare. The treatments themselves were often as dangerous as the diseases they were supposed to cure. Medieval physicians would prepare ointments using animal feces. If animal dung wasn't available, they weren't above using human waste instead. This fecal matter would be mixed with eggs, lard, or wax to create a poultice that was applied directly to infected wounds. While this might seem completely insane by modern standards, there was actually some accidental wisdom in this practice. The feces contained bacteria that sometimes acted on infections in a way similar to how antibiotics work today, but of course, they had no understanding of why it sometimes worked. And the risk of introducing new infections was enormous. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the medieval belief in cannibalistic medicine. Doctors would actually prescribe human blood, flesh, and bones as cures for various ailments. Human blood was recommended for epilepsy, migraines, eye problems, and ulcers. The idea was that consuming parts of healthy humans would transfer their vitality to sick patients. This wasn't some fringe practice either. It was mainstream medical treatment recommended by respected physicians of the time. The religious approach to medical care often proved more harmful than helpful. The medieval period was dominated by the Roman Catholic Church, and this religious influence permeated every aspect of medical practice. Illness was often viewed as God's punishment for sin, which meant that spiritual healing through prayer and repentance was considered just as important as, if not more important than, physical treatment. This religious framework created a dangerous situation where experimental medicine was discouraged or forbidden. There was no systematic testing of treatments to see if they actually worked. If a patient recovered, it was attributed to God's will or the action of the treatment on the body's humours. If they died, it was also God's will. This lack of scientific methodology meant that harmful practices continued for centuries without any real evaluation of their effectiveness. The Church also had specific prohibitions that limited medical advancement. In 1163, a church edict prohibited monks and priests, who often served as doctors, from performing bloodletting. This might sound like a good thing, given what we now know about bloodletting, but it actually led to barbers taking over many medical procedures. These barber surgeons offered bloodletting, cupping, tooth extractions, lancing, and even amputations alongside their regular barbering services. The striped barber pole we still see today actually originated from the blood-stained towels that would hang outside these establishments. The architecture of medieval hospitals was designed more for spiritual salvation than physical healing, and this fundamental misunderstanding of priorities created environments that were essentially death traps. These institutions were built with massive, poorly ventilated halls that trapped disease and suffering within their stone walls. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, for example, was constructed right alongside the Seine River, with its lower levels featuring vaulted passageways that served multiple horrifying purposes. These underground spaces functioned as washhouses, sewage outlets, and landing stages for boats. But perhaps most disturbing of all, these dark corridors became dumping grounds for corpses. There were persistent rumours that medical students would steal bodies from the hospital and drag them into these shadowy vaults to perform illegal dissections. By 1727, these underground passages had become so dangerous and unsanitary that authorities were forced to gate them off at night. The very foundation of the hospital was literally built on a foundation of death and decay, with corpses disappearing into the darkness below, while patients suffered in the halls above. The heating systems in these massive structures were woefully inadequate. While the halls technically had fireplaces or stoves, they were nearly impossible to keep lit effectively. Imagine lying in a bed, sharing space with strangers, in a vast stone chamber that remained perpetually cold and damp. The combination of poor heating, overcrowding, and lack of ventilation created the perfect environment for diseases to spread like wildfire through the patient population. But the physical environment was only part of the horror. The staffing ratios revealed just how abandoned these patients truly were. Consider the 12th century hospital at Saint-Paul in northern France, which maintained only 6 nurses for 60 patients, 6 people to care for 60 sick individuals. That's 1 caregiver for every 10 patients, and these weren't trained medical professionals. They were often religious volunteers with no medical knowledge whatsoever, armed with nothing but good intentions and dangerous ignorance. The nursing care, such as it was, consisted primarily of prayer and the administration of whatever bizarre treatments the physicians had prescribed. These nurses had no understanding of infection control, no concept of hygiene, and no training in actual patient care. They would move from bed to bed, from patient to patient, carrying diseases on their hands and clothing without any awareness of the contamination they were spreading. The diagnostic methods employed by medieval physicians were not just primitive, they were actively harmful. Beyond tasting urine, doctors relied heavily on astrology to guide their medical decisions. The timing of surgeries and the administration of remedies were determined by the position of stars and planets, rather than the patient's actual condition. A patient might be denied treatment for days or weeks while waiting for the stars to align properly, often dying while physicians consulted their astronomical charts. The concept of trepanation represents perhaps the most horrifying example of medieval surgical practice. This procedure involved drilling holes directly into patients' skulls, supposedly to release evil spirits or treat mental illness and head injuries. Patients were fully conscious throughout this ordeal, with no anesthesia or pain relief whatsoever. The procedure was often performed in the patient's home using crude tools, with family members holding the victim down while the operator drilled through bone and into brain tissue. The mortality rates associated with trepanation were staggering, but even those who survived faced a lifetime of complications from the crude surgery. The holes in their skulls were often left open, covered only with pieces of cloth or animal hide. Infections were almost inevitable, and many survivors suffered from ongoing seizures, personality changes, and cognitive impairment for the rest of their lives. The treatment of women in medieval hospitals reveals another layer of medical horror. Doctors had virtually no understanding of female anatomy or reproductive health, yet they held bizarre and dangerous beliefs about women's bodies. Medieval physicians believed that a woman's uterus had a mind of its own and would literally wander around inside her body if she wasn't regularly pregnant. This condition, known as hysteria, was treated with various horrific procedures designed to lure the wayward uterus back into position. Childbirth in medieval hospitals was particularly nightmarish. The mortality rates for both mothers and babies were astronomical, with estimates ranging from 30 to 60%. Women giving birth in hospitals face not only the natural dangers of childbirth, but also the added risks of infection from sharing beds with other patients, including those suffering from contagious diseases. The concept of sterile birthing environments was completely unknown, and women often delivered their babies in the same beds where other patients had recently died. The medical understanding of childhood diseases was equally primitive and dangerous. Medieval physicians believed that many childhood ailments were caused by demonic possession or divine punishment for the parents' sins. Treatments for sick children often involved exorcism rituals, forced fasting, or the application of various toxic substances to their skin. The infant mortality rate of 30 to 40% wasn't just due to natural causes. It was actively increased by medical interventions that did more harm than good. One of the most widespread and dangerous practices was the use of dwale, an early form of anesthesia that was more like a witch's brew than medicine. This concoction contained pig's bile, hemlock juice, lettuce, opium, and vinegar. The mixture was administered to patients before surgery, but the dosing was completely unscientific. Too little, and the patient would experience the full agony of medieval surgery. Too much, and they would simply die from poisoning. There was no middle ground, no careful calibration, just a desperate hope that the patient would survive long enough for the procedure to be completed. The handling of infectious diseases in medieval hospitals was catastrophically misguided. Patients with highly contagious conditions like leprosy, plague, or tuberculosis were often housed in the same wards as those suffering from broken bones or other non-infectious ailments. The concept of quarantine existed in theory, but it was rarely implemented effectively within hospital settings. Instead, diseases spread through the patient population like wildfire, turning hospitals into breeding grounds for epidemics. The Black Death's impact on medieval hospitals was absolutely devastating. When the plague swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing an estimated 30 to 50% of the population, the hospital system completely collapsed. Medical professionals fled their posts to avoid infection, leaving patients to die without any care whatsoever. Those doctors who remained were completely helpless against the disease, relying on useless treatments like bloodletting and purging that only weakened patients further. Even the most respected physicians of the time were peddling treatments that seem insane by modern standards. John R. Dern, who wrote The Art of Medicine and treated royalty, recommended a cure for kidney stones that involved applying a hot plaster smeared with honey and pigeon dung. This wasn't some desperate folk remedy. This was the pinnacle of medieval medical sophistication, prescribed by the most educated doctors of the era. The concept of medical education was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Physicians were forbidden from experimenting on dead bodies or conducting any form of anatomical research. Their understanding of the human body was based on ancient texts and pure speculation rather than direct observation. This meant that generations of doctors practiced medicine without ever actually understanding how the human body functioned, leading to treatments that were not just ineffective, but actively harmful. The economic structure of medieval hospitals created additional layers of suffering for patients. These institutions relied heavily on donations and charity, which meant that the quality of care often depended on the generosity of benefactors rather than medical need. Wealthy patients might receive slightly better treatment, while the poor were left to suffer in the most overcrowded and dangerous sections of the hospital. The food provided to patients was often spoiled or contaminated, with rotten meat from markets being routinely donated to hospitals because administrators figured that sick people didn't deserve fresh food. The leper hospitals, or leprosaria, represent a particularly horrifying chapter in medieval medical care. These specialized institutions housed not just people with what we now know as leprosy, but anyone with any disfiguring skin condition, including eczema, psoriasis, and lupus. Patients were completely isolated from society, forced to live in these institutions until they died. The conditions were appalling, with patients receiving little medical care and being fed donated scraps that were often spoiled or contaminated. Archaeological evidence from leper hospitals reveals the extent of suffering endured by these patients. Excavations at sites like St. Mary Magdalene Hospital in Winchester have uncovered human remains showing advanced stages of disease, with bones displaying evidence of untreated infections, malnutrition, and trauma. These weren't places of healing. They were places where society sent people to die slowly and out of sight. The treatment of mental illness in medieval hospitals was perhaps the most barbaric of all. Patients with psychological conditions were often chained to walls or locked in cells, left to suffer without any understanding or compassion. The prevailing belief was that mental illness was caused by demonic possession, so treatments involved exorcism, beatings, and starvation designed to drive out evil spirits. Patients were sometimes subjected to ice-cold baths or burning hot poultices, procedures that would be considered torture by any modern standard. The medieval approach to pain management was virtually non-existent, leaving patients to endure unimaginable agony during medical procedures. When Dwale wasn't available or proved too dangerous to administer, patients were simply held down by multiple people while conscious surgery was performed on their bodies. The screams echoing through hospital halls were so constant and horrifying that many institutions were built far from populated areas, not for the patient's peace and quiet, but to spare the general public from having to hear the sounds of medical torture. Imagine lying on a wooden table, fully awake, while a barber surgeon saws through your leg bone with a crude metal blade. No anesthesia, no pain relief, just raw, excruciating pain that would continue for hours. The shock alone killed many patients before the actual procedure could be completed. Those who survived the initial surgery faced weeks or months of agony as their wounds slowly healed, if they healed at all, without any form of pain medication or proper wound care. The tools used in medieval hospitals were primitive beyond belief and often caused more damage than the original injuries. Surgical instruments were crude, unsterilized pieces of metal that resembled torture devices more than medical equipment. Bone saws were basically large serrated knives. Forceps were heavy, clunky metal clamps that often crushed tissue rather than gently manipulating it. Cauterization tools were simply pieces of iron heated in fires until they glowed red hot, then pressed directly onto open wounds to stop bleeding. But perhaps most disturbing was the complete lack of understanding about post-operative care. After enduring the trauma of conscious surgery with primitive tools, patients were essentially abandoned to heal or die on their own. Wounds were often left completely uncovered, exposed to the filthy air of overcrowded hospital wards. Infections were so common that pus-filled wounds were actually considered a normal part of the healing process. Doctors called this pus laudable because they believed it was a sign that the body was expelling disease. The dietary practices in medieval hospitals would make your stomach turn. Patients were fed a gruel-like mixture that often contained spoiled ingredients and unknown substances. Fresh food was reserved for the wealthy or for special religious occasions. The standard hospital diet consisted of thin broths made from scraps, stale bread that had been sitting around for days or weeks, and whatever meat had been deemed unfit for sale in the markets. Water quality was another nightmare entirely. Most hospitals drew their water directly from rivers or wells that were contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff. The water used for drinking, cooking, and cleaning wounds was often brown or green in color and reeked of decay. Patients were sometimes forced to drink water that was literally crawling with visible parasites and bacteria, though of course no one understood what those microscopic organisms were or how dangerous they could be. The handling of human waste in medieval hospitals was catastrophically poor. Chamber pots were emptied infrequently and often directly into rivers or onto the ground near the hospital buildings. The smell of human excrement permeated every corner of these institutions. Patients lying in beds would be surrounded by the overwhelming stench of urine and feces, which not only created unbearable living conditions, but also attracted rats, flies, and other disease-carrying pests. Speaking of pests, medieval hospitals were absolutely infested with vermin. Rats scurried freely through the wards, often climbing over patients and contaminating food supplies. These weren't just a nuisance. They were vectors for deadly diseases like the plague. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were constant companions for hospital patients, feeding on their blood and spreading infections from person to person. The itching and discomfort from these parasites added another layer of misery to an already unbearable situation. The treatment of plague victims in medieval hospitals reveals the absolute helplessness of medical practitioners when faced with serious infectious diseases. When the Black Death arrived, doctors had no idea what caused it or how it spread. Their standard treatments not only failed to help patients, but actually made them worse. Bloodletting weakened already dying patients. Attempts to purge the disease through induced vomiting and diarrhea left victims dehydrated and even more vulnerable to death. Some physicians tried to treat plague buboes, the painful swollen lymph nodes characteristic of the disease, by lancing them with dirty knives or burning them with hot irons. These procedures were performed without any form of pain relief and often introduced secondary infections that killed patients even faster than the original plague would have. The mortality rate among plague patients in hospitals approached 100%, not just because the disease was deadly, but because the medical interventions were actively harmful. The psychological trauma inflicted on patients in medieval hospitals was almost as devastating as the physical suffering. Imagine being sick, frightened, and in pain, then being dragged to a place where the sounds of screaming never stopped, where the smell of death hung heavy in the air, and where you were crammed into a bed with strangers who might be dying from unknown diseases. The mental anguish of these patients must have been overwhelming, yet there was no recognition of psychological suffering or any attempt to provide emotional comfort. Children were not spared from these horrors. Pediatric patients were subjected to the same brutal treatments as adults, often with even less chance of survival. Medieval physicians had no understanding of how children's bodies differed from adults, So they administered the same doses of dangerous medicines and performed the same traumatic procedures on tiny, fragile patients. The sight of children screaming in agony while being subjected to medieval medical treatments would have been heartbreaking for any parent forced to witness it. The treatment of women's health issues was particularly barbaric and reveals the deep misogyny embedded in medieval medical practice. Female patients were often blamed for their own illnesses, which were attributed to moral failings or spiritual weaknesses rather than physical causes. Gynecological problems were treated with horrifying procedures that involved inserting hot irons, caustic chemicals, or sharp instruments into women's bodies. The pain must have been indescribable, and the complications from these interventions often led to permanent disability or death. Pregnancy and childbirth in medieval hospitals were death sentences for countless women. The maternal mortality rate was so high that many women wrote wills and made peace with their families before going into labour, fully expecting to die in the process. Hospital births were particularly dangerous because women were forced to give birth in the same beds where other patients had died from infectious diseases, surrounded by contaminated air and attended by people with no understanding of sterile technique. The caesarean section, when it was attempted at all, was essentially a death sentence for the mother. The procedure was performed with no anesthesia, using crude knives to cut through the abdomen and uterus while the woman was fully conscious. The survival rate for mothers who underwent caesarean sections was virtually zero, not just because of the trauma of the surgery itself, but because of the inevitable infections that followed. The procedure was usually only attempted when the mother was already dying, in a desperate attempt to save the baby. Newborn babies born in medieval hospitals faced their own set of horrors. The infant mortality rate in these institutions was even higher than the already catastrophic rates in private homes. Babies were often placed in the same beds as sick adults, exposing them to deadly infections from the moment of birth. There was no understanding of the special nutritional needs of infants, and many babies starved to death even when their mothers survived childbirth. The concept of medical records was virtually non-existent, which meant that there was no way to track which treatments were effective and which were harmful. Doctors made the same deadly mistakes over and over again because there was no systematic way to learn from previous failures. Patients would receive treatments that had killed dozens of previous patients because no one bothered to document outcomes or analyze results. The training of medical professionals was based entirely on ancient texts, rather than practical experience or direct observation. Medical students would spend years memorizing the writings of Greek and Roman physicians who had lived centuries earlier, without ever examining an actual patient or observing real surgical procedures. This meant that even the most educated doctors were working from a foundation of outdated and often completely incorrect information. The hierarchy within medieval hospitals created additional suffering for patients. The most experienced physicians rarely dealt directly with patients, instead sending their students or assistants to perform examinations and treatments. These inexperienced practitioners would experiment on patients, trying different procedures and medications without any real understanding of their effects. Patients became unwilling test subjects for dangerous medical theories that had no basis in scientific reality. The economic incentives in medieval medicine were completely backwards, encouraging harmful practices while discouraging effective care. Physicians were paid more for complex, dramatic treatments than for simple, effective ones. This meant that doctors had financial motivations to subject patients to elaborate and dangerous procedures, rather than providing basic comfort care that might actually help them recover. The sicker a patient became, the more money doctors could make from treating their increasingly complex symptoms. The religious ceremonies performed in medieval hospitals often caused additional trauma for dying patients. Last rites were administered to conscious patients who might still have had a chance of recovery, essentially telling them that death was inevitable and that they should prepare to meet their maker. The psychological impact of being told by religious authorities that you were about to die must have been devastating, potentially causing some patients to give up hope when they might otherwise have fought to survive. The disposal of bodies in medieval hospitals was handled with shocking callousness and lack of dignity. Dead patients were often stacked like cordwood in basement rooms or storage areas until they could be buried in mass graves. During epidemic periods, the death toll was so high that hospitals simply couldn't keep up with proper burial practices. Bodies were sometimes thrown into rivers or burned in large pyres, with little regard for identification or notification of families. The air quality inside medieval hospitals was toxic beyond imagination. The combination of human waste, rotting food, infected wounds, and decomposing bodies created an atmosphere that was literally poisonous to breathe. Patients who might have recovered from their original ailments often succumbed to respiratory problems caused by the contaminated air they were forced to breathe day and night. The noise levels in these institutions would have been psychologically damaging. The constant sounds of screaming, moaning, coughing, and crying created a cacophony of human suffering that never stopped. Patients trying to rest and heal were subjected to this audio assault 24 hours a day, preventing the peaceful sleep that their bodies desperately needed for recovery. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of medieval hospitals was the complete absence of hope. Patients entered these institutions, knowing that they were more likely to die than to recover. Families said goodbye to loved ones at the hospital doors, understanding that they might never see them alive again. The psychological burden of this certainty must have been crushing for everyone involved. The lack of any effective pain management meant that patients spent their final days or weeks in constant, excruciating agony. There was no relief, no comfort, no respite from suffering. Medieval hospitals weren't places of healing. They were places where people went to experience the worst possible deaths imaginable, surrounded by the screams of fellow sufferers in conditions that would make a battlefield seem merciful by comparison. Iful by comparison. The mental anguish inflicted by medieval medical practices extended far beyond the physical torture of procedures themselves. Consider the psychological warfare that patients endured simply by existing in these hellish environments. The sounds alone would have driven anyone to the brink of madness. Imagine trying to rest while the person next to you slowly dies from gangrene, their delirious screams echoing through stone halls that amplified every sound of suffering. The acoustic nightmare of medieval hospitals was relentless, a symphony of human agony that played without pause, day and night. But the auditory assault was just one layer of the sensory hell that awaited patients. The visual horror was equally traumatic. Dead bodies weren't immediately removed from wards. Sometimes patients would wake up next to corpses that had been lying there for hours or even days, waiting for someone to notice and haul them away. Children would witness adults dying in grotesque ways, their final moments playing out in vivid, terrifying detail just inches away from their own beds. The smell of death permeated everything. It wasn't just the obvious sense of human waste and infection. It was the sweet, cloying odour of decomposing flesh that clung to clothing, hair, and skin. Patients couldn't escape it, couldn't get away from the constant reminder that they too might soon be contributing to that overwhelming stench of mortality. The smell would follow visitors home, marking them as having come from the place where hope went to die. Medieval physicians had developed an elaborate system of humoral medicine that sounds almost reasonable until you understand what it meant in practice. They believed that the human body contained 4 essential fluids, and that illness resulted from these fluids becoming unbalanced. The cure, naturally, was to restore balance through the most violent means possible. This wasn't gentle rebalancing. This was medical warfare waged against the patient's own body. The tools used for bloodletting reveal the medieval obsession with draining life from patients in the name of healing. The phlegm, that brass contraption with multiple blades, came in different sizes for different types of patients. Larger blades for robust adults, smaller ones for children and the elderly. The fact that they made specialized bloodletting equipment for children tells you everything you need to know about medieval medical priorities. No one was too young, too old, or too weak to escape the blade. But bloodletting was just the beginning of the humoral nightmare. Medieval doctors also practiced cupping, a procedure that involved heating glass or metal cups and placing them on the patient's skin to create suction. The heat would create a vacuum that would literally pull blood to the surface, often bursting capillaries and creating painful welts and bruises across the patient's body. Some practitioners would combine cupping with scarification, making small cuts in the skin before applying the heated cups to draw out even more blood. The wet cupping process was particularly brutal. After creating the suction, practitioners would remove the cups and make incisions in the swollen skin, then reapply the cups to suck out blood through the fresh wounds. Patients would be left with patterns of circular scars across their backs, chests, and limbs, permanent reminders of the medical torture they had endured. The pain was excruciating, and the blood loss often left patients weaker than when they had arrived. Leeching represented the premium bloodletting experience, reserved for wealthy patients who could afford the finest medical parasites available. Medieval physicians classified leeches by region and species, believing that different types of leeches were appropriate for different ailments. Hungarian leeches were considered superior for treating headaches, while French leeches were preferred for digestive issues. This wasn't random superstition. Medieval medicine had developed an entire taxonomy of medical bloodsucking that practitioners took very seriously. The application of leeches was a lengthy, disgusting process that could last for hours. Physicians would attach dozens of the creatures to a patient's body, monitoring their feeding progress and replacing them as they became engorged with blood. Patients would lie helpless while these slimy parasites slowly drained their life force, feeling each individual leech latching onto their skin and beginning its methodical feeding. The psychological impact of watching your own blood disappear into these writhing creatures must have been almost as traumatic as the physical effects. Medieval surgery represented human suffering elevated to an art form. Without anesthesia, every procedure became an endurance test that many patients failed. The mortality rate from surgery wasn't just high because of infection or blood loss. Many patients literally died from shock and pain during the procedures themselves. Their bodies simply couldn't handle the trauma of conscious surgery, and they would slip into unconsciousness and death while still on the operating table. Amputation was one of the most common surgical procedures, and the technique reveals the medieval approach to medicine in all its horrifying glory. Patients would be held down by multiple assistants, while the surgeon used a bone saw to cut through limbs. The sound of metal grinding through bone, the spray of blood, the patient's screams. All of this took place in rooms that were already filled with other suffering patients who could hear and see everything that was happening. The cauterization process that followed amputation was equally nightmarish. Red-hot irons would be pressed directly onto the bleeding stumps to seal the wounds and prevent hemorrhaging. The smell of burning flesh would fill the air while patients writhed in agony from pain that was literally indescribable. Many patients would mercifully lose consciousness during cauterization, but others remained awake throughout the entire ordeal, their screams echoing through hospital corridors for hours afterward. Trepanation, the drilling of holes in patients' skulls, represents perhaps the most psychologically disturbing surgical procedure in medieval medicine. This wasn't a rare, desperate measure performed only in extreme circumstances. It was a routine treatment recommended for headaches, mental illness, epilepsy, and head injuries. Medieval physicians genuinely believed that drilling holes in people's heads would release evil spirits or relieve pressure on the brain. The trepanation process began with the patient being forcibly restrained, often tied down to prevent movement during the procedure. The surgeon would use a specialized drill, essentially a corkscrew-like device, to slowly bore through the skull. The drilling could take hours, with the surgeon periodically stopping to clear bone fragments and blood from the growing hole. Patients remained fully conscious throughout this process, feeling every turn of the drill as it ground deeper into their heads. The survival rate for trepanation was surprisingly high, which only encouraged medieval physicians to perform the procedure more frequently. However, survival didn't mean recovery. Many patients suffered from ongoing complications, including seizures, personality changes, and cognitive impairment for the rest of their lives. The holes in their skulls were often covered with pieces of cloth or animal hide, creating permanent vulnerabilities to infection and further injury. Medieval obstetrics represented a special category of medical horror, reserved specifically for women. The understanding of female anatomy was so poor that physicians believed a woman's uterus could literally detach itself and wander around inside her body. This condition, called hysteria, was treated with procedures designed to lure the wayward organ back into position. These treatments included fumigating the patient's vaginal area with burning herbs, inserting foreign objects into the uterus, or applying pressure to various parts of the abdomen. Childbirth complications were handled with medieval medicine's characteristic combination of ignorance and violence. Difficult births were often attributed to the mother's moral failings or spiritual weakness, rather than physical problems. When babies became stuck during delivery, medieval physicians would use crude metal instruments to extract them, often causing severe internal injuries to both mother and child. The forceps used in medieval obstetrics were heavy, unsterilized metal clamps that frequently crushed delicate tissues and caused massive bleeding. Caesarean sections were performed almost exclusively on dying mothers, not to save the woman, but to attempt to rescue the baby after the mother had already been given up for lost. These procedures were performed without any anesthesia, using whatever sharp instruments were available. The surgeon would cut through the abdominal wall and uterus while the woman was fully conscious, if she was still alive when the procedure began. The survival rate for mothers undergoing caesarean sections was essentially 0%. The treatment of pediatric patients reveals medieval medicine's complete lack of understanding about childhood development and physiology. Children were essentially treated as miniature adults, receiving the same dangerous medications and procedures in smaller doses. There was no recognition that children's bodies process drugs differently than adult bodies, leading to countless cases of accidental poisoning and overdose. Childhood diseases were often attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment for the parents' sins. Treatments for sick children frequently involved religious rituals, combined with medical procedures that would be considered torture by any modern standard. Children with fever might be subjected to ice baths or wrapped in scalding hot cloths. Those with seizures could face trepanation or violent exorcism rituals designed to drive out evil spirits. The psychological trauma inflicted on children in medieval hospitals was beyond comprehension. Young patients would watch adults die horrible deaths while receiving their own painful treatments from people dressed in religious robes who claimed to be helping them. The combination of physical pain, terror, and confusion must have been overwhelming for young minds trying to understand why they were being hurt by the very people who were supposed to make them better. Medieval dentistry deserves special mention as one of the most primitively brutal branches of medicine. Tooth extractions were performed by barbers and blacksmiths using tools that were essentially modified pliers. There was no anesthesia, no understanding of sterile technique, and no concept of preserving healthy teeth. The standard treatment for any dental problem was extraction, regardless of how minor the original issue might have been. The tooth extraction process was a public spectacle that drew crowds of onlookers who came to watch the entertainment. Patients would be held down while the practitioner gripped the offending tooth with metal pliers and attempted to wrench it from the jaw. The tools often slipped, breaking teeth into fragments that had to be dug out of the gums with sharp instruments. Massive bleeding was common, and infections from these crude extractions frequently led to death from sepsis. Dental abscesses were treated with equally horrifying methods. Practitioners would use red-hot needles to puncture infected gums, or apply caustic chemicals that would burn away infected tissue along with healthy surrounding areas. The pain from these treatments was so severe that many patients would beg to have their teeth pulled rather than undergo attempts to save them. The medieval understanding of infectious disease was so fundamentally wrong that their quarantine practices actually made epidemics worse rather than better. When plague or other contagious diseases appeared, authorities would often lock infected patients inside buildings with healthy people, creating perfect conditions for rapid disease transmission. The concept of isolating sick individuals to prevent spread was understood in theory, but was rarely implemented effectively. Hospital quarantine procedures were particularly counterproductive. Patients with obvious signs of plague would be placed in the same wards as those suffering from broken bones or other non-infectious conditions. The rationale was that all sick people belonged together, regardless of what was wrong with them. This practice turned every hospital ward into a breeding ground for whatever diseases were currently circulating in the community. The treatment of plague victims represents medieval medicine at its most helplessly destructive. When patients developed the characteristic buboes of plague, physicians would attempt to treat these swollen lymph nodes by cutting them open with dirty knives. The theory was that releasing the pus would cure the disease, but in reality, these procedures only introduced secondary infections that killed patients even faster than the original plague would have. Some physicians tried to treat plague by burning the buboes with red-hot irons, believing that fire would purify the infected tissue. The pain from this procedure was so intense that many patients died from shock before the burning was completed. Those who survived the cauterization faced weeks of agony as the burned tissue slowly healed, if it healed at all, without any form of pain medication or proper wound care. The psychological impact of plague on hospital staff was devastating and created additional dangers for patients. Many physicians and nurses fled their posts when plague appeared, leaving patients to die without any care whatsoever. Those medical personnel who remained were often paralyzed by fear and superstition, making irrational treatment decisions based on panic rather than any medical reasoning. The economic structure of medieval hospitals created perverse incentives that prioritized profit over patient welfare. Physicians were typically paid based on the complexity of treatments they provided, rather than patient outcomes. This meant that doctors had financial motivations to subject patients to elaborate and expensive procedures, rather than providing simple comfort care that might actually help them recover. Wealthy patients could purchase better treatment, but even the premium medical care available to nobles and merchants was based on the same fundamentally flawed understanding of medicine that killed peasants. Rich patients might receive more attention from physicians, better food and private rooms, but they were still subjected to the same dangerous bloodletting, toxic medications, and barbaric surgical procedures that proved fatal for patients of all social classes. The donation system that funded medieval hospitals created additional problems for patient care. Benefactors would often specify exactly how their contributions should be used, sometimes requiring that certain prayers be said, or that specific treatments be administered regardless of medical necessity. Patients might be forced to undergo particular procedures not because doctors thought they would help, but because the hospital's funding required it. The corruption within hospital administrations meant that resources intended for patient care were often diverted to other purposes. Food donations meant for patients would be sold for profit. Medications would be watered down or replaced with cheaper alternatives, and equipment would be allowed to deteriorate rather than being properly maintained. Patients suffered not just from medical ignorance, but from active neglect and theft by the very institutions supposedly dedicated to their care. Medieval hospitals operated under a fundamental misunderstanding of their purpose and function. Rather than focusing on healing and recovery, They were designed primarily as places where people went to die in a state of spiritual grace. The emphasis was on preparing souls for the afterlife rather than preserving life in this world. This theological approach to medicine created institutions that were more concerned with last rites than with actual medical treatment. The religious ceremonies performed in hospital wards often caused additional trauma for patients who might still have had hope of recovery. Being administered last rites while still conscious and aware was essentially being told that death was inevitable and imminent. The psychological impact of this religious death sentence must have been devastating, potentially causing some patients to give up hope when they might otherwise have fought to survive. The record-keeping practices in medieval hospitals were so poor that there was no way to learn from mistakes or identify effective treatments. Deaths were recorded in religious terms rather than medical ones, attributed to God's will rather than to specific causes or failed treatments. This meant that the same deadly procedures were repeated endlessly because no one bothered to track which interventions actually helped patients and which ones killed them. The training of medical personnel was based entirely on memorizing ancient texts rather than observing real patients or learning from practical experience. Medical students would spend years studying the writings of Greek and Roman physicians who had lived centuries earlier, without ever examining living patients or witnessing actual medical procedures. This created a medical profession that was highly educated in theory but completely incompetent in practice. The hierarchy within medieval hospitals meant that the most experienced physicians rarely dealt directly with patients, instead delegating actual patient care to inexperienced students and assistants. These untrained practitioners would experiment on patients, trying different procedures and medications without understanding their effects. Patients became unwilling test subjects for dangerous medical theories that had no basis in scientific observation or evidence. The complete absence of any scientific method in medieval medicine meant that superstition and tradition carried the same weight as empirical observation. Treatments were prescribed based on astrological charts, religious beliefs, and ancient texts, rather than on evidence of effectiveness. This created a medical system that was not only ineffective, but actively harmful, causing more suffering than it prevented. The medieval approach to pain management was essentially non-existent, leaving patients to endure unimaginable agony without relief. The concept that pain itself was harmful and should be minimized was foreign to medieval medical thinking. Instead, pain was often viewed as spiritually beneficial, a form of penance that would purify the soul and prepare it for heaven. This attitude meant that even when pain relief methods were available, they were often withheld for religious reasons. The tools and equipment used in medieval hospitals were primitive, unsanitary, and often dangerous in themselves. Surgical instruments were crude pieces of metal that had to be sharpened frequently because they became dull from use. There was no understanding of metallurgy or precision manufacturing, so medical tools were inconsistent in quality and frequently broke during procedures, leaving metal fragments in patients' bodies. The storage and preparation of medications was haphazard and dangerous. Herbal remedies were often contaminated with toxic substances, incorrectly identified plants, or harmful additives that were included because they looked or smelled similar to the intended ingredients. There was no quality control, no standardization of dosages, and no understanding of drug interactions or contraindications. The water used in medieval hospitals was drawn from sources that were heavily contaminated with human and animal waste. This water was used for drinking, cooking, cleaning wounds, and preparing medications, spreading disease throughout the hospital population. The concept of water purification was unknown, and even basic filtration was rarely practiced. The disposal of medical waste was handled with shocking carelessness. Used bandages, surgical instruments, and human tissue were often simply thrown into piles behind hospital buildings or dumped into nearby rivers. This created breeding grounds for disease-carrying pests and contaminated local water supplies, spreading illness throughout the surrounding communities. The architectural design of medieval hospitals prioritized religious symbolism over practical medical needs. Buildings were constructed to impress donors and demonstrate piety rather than to provide effective healthcare environments. The result was structures that looked impressive, but were functionally useless for medical purposes, with poor ventilation, inadequate lighting, and layouts that made patient care more difficult rather than easier. The heating systems in medieval hospitals were catastrophically inadequate for the massive stone structures that housed hundreds of suffering patients. These buildings were constructed more like cathedrals than medical facilities, with soaring ceilings that trapped cold air and stone walls that conducted heat away from the interior spaces. The few fireplaces that existed were poorly positioned and inadequately ventilated, filling the wards with smoke while providing minimal warmth to patients lying in distant corners. Imagine being bedridden with a fever, your body already struggling to regulate its temperature, while lying in a vast stone chamber that remained perpetually cold and damp. The combination of poor heating, overcrowding, and inadequate ventilation created perfect conditions for respiratory infections to spread like wildfire through the patient population. Tuberculosis thrived in these environments, moving from bed to bed as patients coughed and wheezed in the stagnant, frigid air. The lighting situation was equally dire. These enormous halls relied primarily on small windows and occasional oil lamps or candles for illumination. During winter months or cloudy days, much of the medical care was performed in near darkness. Physicians attempting to examine patients or perform procedures would squint in the dim light, often missing obvious signs of infection or injury that might have been treatable if they had been properly visible. But perhaps most disturbing was how these environmental conditions affected the psychological state of patients who were already suffering from physical ailments. The constant cold, the perpetual gloom, the overwhelming sounds of human misery echoing off stone walls, all of this created an atmosphere of hopelessness that must have been crushing to anyone clinging to thoughts of recovery. Patients weren't just fighting their diseases, they were battling an environment that seemed designed to break their spirits and hasten their deaths. The medical understanding of women's reproductive health reveals some of the most bizarre and dangerous beliefs in medieval medicine. Physicians genuinely believed that a woman's uterus was a separate entity with its own consciousness and desires. According to medical texts of the time, this organ would become restless if a woman wasn't regularly pregnant, and would literally detach itself from its proper location to wander around inside her body in search of satisfaction. This condition, known as hysteria, was treated with procedures that sound more like torture than medicine. Physicians would attempt to lure the wayward uterus back into position using aromatic substances applied to the vaginal area, believing that pleasant smells would attract the organ back to its proper location. Alternatively, they might use foul-smelling substances near the patient's nose and mouth, theorizing that the uterus would flee from unpleasant odors and return to its normal position. The treatments for hysteria often involved inserting foreign objects into the uterus, including heated metal rods, bundles of herbs, or pieces of animal tissue. These procedures were performed without any anesthesia or understanding of sterile technique, inevitably leading to severe infections and internal injuries. Women would endure excruciating pain while physicians manipulated their internal organs based on completely fictional medical theories. Menstrual disorders were attributed to an excess of corrupt blood that needed to be purged from the body through violent means. Women suffering from heavy bleeding would be subjected to additional bloodletting to remove even more blood from their systems, a treatment that often proved fatal due to severe anemia and blood loss. Those with irregular periods might be given toxic herbal concoctions designed to force menstruation, often resulting in poisoning or internal hemorrhaging. The medieval approach to pregnancy was equally terrifying for expectant mothers. Physicians believed that the developing fetus could be influenced by the mother's thoughts, emotions, and experiences, leading to elaborate restrictions on what pregnant women could think about or look at. Women were forbidden from seeing disabled individuals or frightening images based on the theory that such sights would cause their babies to be born with similar deformities. Prenatal care consisted primarily of bloodletting and purging to maintain the proper balance of humours in the pregnant woman's body. Expectant mothers would be regularly bled throughout their pregnancies, weakening them at the very time when they needed maximum strength for the challenges of childbirth. The bloodletting was often so extreme that women would arrive at labour already severely anemic and unable to cope with the normal blood loss associated with delivery. The actual process of childbirth in medieval hospitals was a nightmare of ignorance and intervention. Midwives and physicians had no understanding of the stages of labour or the normal progression of delivery. They would often attempt to speed up the process through violent manipulation, pulling on the baby or pressing forcefully on the mother's abdomen in ways that caused severe internal injuries to both mother and child. When complications arose during delivery, the medieval medical response was catastrophically inappropriate. Babies who became stuck during birth were extracted using crude metal instruments that frequently crushed their skulls or broke their bones. These forceps were heavy, unsterilized tools that caused massive tearing and bleeding in the birth canal. The mortality rate for babies delivered with forceps was extremely high, and those who survived often suffered from permanent neurological damage. Caesarean sections were performed almost exclusively as a last resort when the mother was already dying, not to save her life, but to attempt to rescue the baby for baptism before it too died. These procedures were carried out with whatever sharp instruments were available, often kitchen knives or crude surgical blades. The surgeon would cut through the abdominal wall and uterus while the woman was fully conscious, causing indescribable pain and massive bleeding. The survival rate for mothers undergoing caesarean sections was virtually 0%. The procedure was essentially a form of human sacrifice, trading the mother's life for the slim possibility of saving the baby's soul through emergency baptism. Even when babies were successfully extracted alive, they rarely survived more than a few hours without their mother's care and the antibodies provided by breast milk. Postpartum care was equally dangerous and misguided. New mothers were kept in bed for weeks after delivery, supposedly to allow their bodies to recover, but actually creating perfect conditions for blood clots and infections to develop. They were fed thin broths and weak ale, inadequate nutrition for women who had just endured the trauma of medieval childbirth and needed to recover their strength. Breastfeeding was discouraged among wealthy women, who were expected to hire wet nurses to feed their babies. These wet nurses were often poor women with questionable health who had recently given birth themselves. The babies would be exposed to whatever diseases the wet nurses might be carrying, while being deprived of the specific antibodies and nutrients that their own mother's milk would have provided. The treatment of newborn babies in medieval hospitals was characterized by shocking ignorance about infant physiology and needs. Babies were often wrapped so tightly in swaddling clothes that they could barely breathe, based on the belief that tight binding would help their bones grow straight and strong. These swaddling clothes were rarely changed or cleaned, creating breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites that would cause deadly infections. Newborns who showed any signs of illness or abnormality were often abandoned by hospital staff, who believed that such conditions indicated divine disfavor or demonic influence. Babies with birthmarks, cleft lips, or other minor deformities might be left to die without any attempt at treatment or care. The infant mortality rate in medieval hospitals was catastrophically high, not just due to natural causes, but because of active neglect and harmful medical interventions. The medieval understanding of pediatric medicine was virtually non-existent. Children were treated as miniature adults, receiving the same dangerous medications and procedures in supposedly smaller doses. However, there was no scientific understanding of how children's bodies process drugs differently from adult bodies, leading to countless cases of accidental poisoning and overdose. Childhood diseases were often attributed to supernatural causes rather than natural ones. Children with fever might be subjected to exorcism rituals designed to drive out evil spirits, or they might be bled repeatedly to remove corrupt humors from their systems. Those suffering from seizures could face trepanation, having holes drilled in their skulls while fully conscious to release whatever demons were supposedly possessing them. The psychological trauma inflicted on children in medieval hospitals was beyond comprehension. Young patients would watch adults die horrible deaths in the beds around them while receiving their own painful treatments from people dressed in religious robes who claimed to be helping them. The combination of physical pain, terror, and confusion must have been overwhelming for young minds trying to understand why they were being hurt by the people who were supposed to make them better. Medieval dentistry deserves special recognition as perhaps the most primitively brutal branch of medical practice. Dental problems were extremely common due to poor nutrition and complete lack of oral hygiene, but the treatments available were often worse than the original conditions. Toothaches were treated with hot irons pressed directly against the affected teeth, burning through the enamel and into the nerve tissue while patients screamed in agony. Tooth extractions were performed by barbers, blacksmiths, and other tradespeople using tools that were essentially modified pliers or pincers. There was no anesthesia available, and patients would be held down by multiple assistants while the practitioner gripped the offending tooth and attempted to wrench it from the jaw. The extraction tools often slipped, breaking teeth into fragments that had to be dug out of the gums with sharp instruments. The tooth extraction process was sometimes turned into public entertainment, with crowds gathering to watch the spectacle of patients writhing in pain while their teeth were forcibly removed. These public extractions served as both medical procedures and community events, with onlookers placing bets on how many teeth could be extracted before the patient lost consciousness from pain and blood loss. Dental abscesses were treated with methods that defied all logic and compassion. Practitioners would use red-hot needles to puncture infected gums, or they would apply caustic chemicals that would burn away infected tissue along with healthy surrounding areas. The pain from these treatments was so severe that many patients would beg to have their teeth pulled rather than undergo attempts to save them. The medieval approach to treating jaw injuries reveals the complete absence of understanding about facial anatomy and bone structure. Broken jaws were often left untreated, healing incorrectly and leaving patients unable to chew or speak properly for the rest of their lives. When treatment was attempted, it usually involved wiring the jaw shut with metal bands that cut into the gums and cause severe infections. Oral cancers and tumors were treated with surgical removal using crude knives and saws performed without anesthesia while patients were held down by assistants. The survival rate for oral surgery was extremely low, not just because of the trauma of the procedures themselves, but because of the inevitable infections that followed. Patients who survived the initial surgery often died weeks later from sepsis, caused by contaminated surgical instruments. The understanding of infectious diseases in medieval hospitals was so fundamentally flawed that quarantine practices often made epidemics worse rather than better. When contagious diseases appeared, hospital administrators would typically respond by cramming even more patients into already overcrowded wards, believing that isolating all sick people together would contain the spread of disease. The concept of different types of infectious diseases was completely foreign to medieval medical thinking. Patients with plague would be placed in the same beds as those suffering from tuberculosis, leprosy, or dysentery, creating perfect conditions for multiple diseases to spread simultaneously through the hospital population. A patient who entered with a broken bone might leave with 3 different fatal infections, assuming they left alive at all. Hospital quarantine procedures were particularly counterproductive because they were based on religious rather than medical principles. Patients were isolated not to prevent disease transmission, but to separate the morally pure from the spiritually contaminated. This meant that people with identical symptoms might be treated completely differently. depending on their social status or perceived moral character. The treatment of plague victims represents medieval medicine at its most helplessly destructive. When patients developed the characteristic buboes of bubonic plague, physicians would attempt to treat these swollen lymph nodes by cutting them open with dirty knives, believing that releasing the pus would cure the disease. These procedures were performed without any anesthesia or understanding of sterile technique, invariably introducing secondary infections that killed patients even faster than the original plague. Some physicians attempted to treat plague by burning the buboes with red-hot irons, theorizing that fire would purify the infected tissue and drive out the disease. The pain from this procedure was so intense that many patients died from shock during the treatment itself. Those who survived the cauterization faced weeks of agony as the burned tissue slowly healed, if it healed at all, without any form of pain medication or proper wound care. The psychological impact of plague on hospital staff created additional dangers for patients who were already fighting for their lives. Many physicians and nurses fled their posts when plague appeared in their hospitals, abandoning patients to die without any care whatsoever. Those medical personnel who remained were often paralyzed by fear and superstition, making irrational treatment decisions based on panic rather than any medical reasoning. The economic incentives in medieval medicine created perverse motivations that prioritized profit over patient welfare. Physicians were typically compensated based on the complexity and duration of treatments they provided, rather than on patient outcomes or recovery rates. This meant that doctors had financial reasons to subject patients to elaborate and expensive procedures, rather than providing simple comfort care that might actually help them get better. Wealthy patients could purchase more extensive treatment, but even the premium medical care available to nobles and merchants was based on the same fundamentally flawed understanding of disease and healing that proved fatal for patients of all social classes. Rich patients might receive more attention from physicians, better food, and private rooms, but they were still subjected to the same dangerous bloodletting, toxic medications, and barbaric surgical procedures. The donation system that funded medieval hospitals created additional problems for patient care because benefactors would often specify exactly how their contributions should be used. Donors might require that certain prayers be recited, or that specific treatments be administered regardless of medical necessity. Patients could be forced to undergo particular procedures not because doctors thought they would help, but because the hospital's funding sources demanded it. Corruption within hospital administrations meant that resources intended for patient care were frequently diverted to other purposes. Food donations meant for patients would be sold for profit, medications would be diluted or replaced with cheaper alternatives, and medical equipment would be allowed to deteriorate rather than being properly maintained. Patients suffered not just from medical ignorance but from active neglect and theft by the very institutions supposedly dedicated to their welfare. The record-keeping practices in medieval hospitals were so inadequate that there was no systematic way to learn from medical failures or identify effective treatments. Deaths were typically recorded in religious rather than medical terms, attributed to divine will rather than to specific causes or failed interventions. This meant that the same deadly procedures were repeated endlessly because no one bothered to track which treatments actually helped patients and which ones killed them. The training of medical personnel was based entirely on memorizing ancient texts rather than observing real patients or learning from practical experience. Medical students would spend years studying the writings of Greek and Roman physicians who had lived centuries earlier, without ever examining living patients or witnessing actual medical procedures. This created a medical profession that was highly educated in obsolete theory, but completely incompetent in practical application. The hierarchy within medieval hospitals meant that the most experienced physicians rarely dealt directly with patients, instead delegating actual patient care to inexperienced students and assistants. These untrained practitioners would experiment on patients, trying different procedures and medications without any understanding of their effects or potential consequences. Patients became unwilling test subjects for dangerous medical theories that had no basis in scientific observation or empirical evidence. The complete absence of any scientific methodology in medieval medicine meant that superstition and ancient tradition carried the same weight as direct observation and evidence. Treatments were prescribed based on astrological charts, religious beliefs, and centuries-old texts, rather than on proof of effectiveness or safety. This created a medical system that was not only ineffective, but actively harmful, causing more suffering and death than it prevented. The medieval approach to pain management was essentially non-existent, leaving patients to endure unimaginable agony without any relief or comfort. The concept that pain itself was harmful and should be minimized was completely foreign to medieval medical thinking. Instead, suffering was often viewed as spiritually beneficial, a form of penance that would purify the soul and prepare it for the afterlife. This religious attitude toward pain meant that even when primitive pain relief methods were available, they were often withheld for theological reasons. Patients were expected to offer up their suffering as a sacrifice to God, and attempts to alleviate pain were sometimes viewed as interfering with divine will. The result was that people endured procedures that would be considered torture by any modern standard, all while being told that their agony was spiritually beneficial. The tools and equipment used in medieval hospitals were primitive, unsanitary, and often dangerous in themselves. Surgical instruments were crude pieces of metal that had to be sharpened frequently because they became dull from repeated use on bone and tissue. There was no understanding of metallurgy or precision manufacturing, so medical tools were inconsistent in quality and frequently broke during procedures, leaving metal fragments embedded in patients' bodies. The preparation and storage of medications was haphazard and potentially lethal. Herbal remedies were often contaminated with toxic substances, incorrectly identified plants, or harmful additives that were included simply because they looked or smelled similar to the intended ingredients. There was no quality control, no standardization of dosages, and no understanding of dangerous drug interactions or contraindications. The water supply used throughout medieval hospitals was drawn from sources that were heavily contaminated with human and animal waste. This polluted water was used for drinking, cooking, cleaning wounds, and preparing medications, effectively spreading disease throughout the entire hospital population. The concept of water purification was unknown, and even basic filtration through cloth or sand was rarely practiced. The disposal of medical waste was handled with shocking carelessness and complete disregard for public health. Used bandages, surgical instruments, human tissue, and other contaminated materials were often simply thrown into piles behind hospital buildings or dumped directly into nearby rivers and streams. This created breeding grounds for disease-carrying pests and contaminated local water supplies, spreading illness throughout the surrounding communities. The architectural design of medieval hospitals prioritized religious symbolism and donor impressions over practical medical functionality. Buildings were constructed to demonstrate piety and attract charitable contributions rather than to provide effective healthcare environments. The result was structures that looked impressive from the outside but were functionally useless for medical purposes, with poor ventilation, inadequate lighting, and layouts that made patient care more difficult rather than easier. These massive stone buildings were essentially religious monuments that happened to house sick people, rather than medical facilities designed for healing. The long, narrow halls that characterized medieval hospital architecture were perfect for religious processions and impressive visual displays, but they created acoustic nightmares where the sounds of suffering echoed endlessly off stone walls. Patients couldn't escape the constant reminder of death and agony that surrounded them on all sides. The ventilation systems in these buildings were virtually non-existent, creating stagnant air that trapped diseases and toxic fumes from various medical procedures. Fresh air was considered dangerous because medieval physicians believed that illness could be transmitted through bad air, so windows were kept closed and sealed whenever possible. This created perfect conditions for airborne diseases to spread rapidly through the patient population. The lighting in medieval hospitals was so inadequate that much medical care was performed in near darkness. The small windows that existed were often positioned high in the walls for architectural rather than practical reasons, providing minimal illumination for the areas where patients actually lay. Oil lamps and candles were expensive and considered fire hazards in buildings filled with sick people, so they were used sparingly if at all. Medical procedures performed in dim light were even more dangerous than they would have been under normal circumstances. Physicians attempting to examine patients or perform surgery would squint in the gloom, often missing obvious signs of infection or injury that might have been treatable if they had been properly visible. The combination of poor lighting and primitive medical knowledge created a perfect storm of diagnostic failure and therapeutic disaster. The heating systems in these enormous stone structures were completely inadequate for maintaining temperatures that would support patient recovery. The massive thermal mass of stone walls and floors absorbed whatever heat was generated by small fireplaces, leaving patients to lie in perpetually cold and damp conditions that weakened their immune systems and slowed healing processes. Patients with fevers would shiver uncontrollably in beds that were never warm, while those with respiratory conditions would struggle to breathe in the cold, humid air that filled these cavernous spaces. The contrast between the stone floors and the few small fires created dangerous temperature gradients that caused rapid fluctuations in patients' body temperatures, adding thermal stress to their existing medical problems. The acoustics of medieval hospitals created a psychological torture chamber where the sounds of human suffering were amplified and prolonged by stone surfaces that reflected every scream, moan, and death rattle. Patients trying to rest and heal were subjected to an endless cacophony of human misery that prevented the peaceful sleep their bodies desperately needed for recovery. The constant noise also made communication between patients and medical personnel extremely difficult. Physicians attempting to examine patients or take medical histories had to shout to be heard over the background din of suffering, often missing important symptoms or patient concerns that might have guided treatment decisions. The result was that even the limited medical knowledge available was often poorly applied because of communication failures caused by the hostile acoustic environment. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of medieval hospital architecture was how it reinforced the message that patients were there to die rather than to recover. These buildings looked and felt like tombs or crypts, with their stone construction, dim lighting, and sepulchral atmosphere. Patients entering these institutions would immediately understand that they had been brought to a place of death, not healing, and this realization must have been crushing to anyone who still harbored hopes of recovery. The very design of these spaces communicated hopelessness and despair more effectively than any words could have done. Patients weren't just fighting their diseases, they were battling an environment that seemed specifically engineered to break their spirits and hasten their deaths. The architecture itself became a form of psychological warfare waged against people who were already suffering from physical ailments and desperately needed reasons to hope and fight for survival. Survival, the medical understanding of mental illness in medieval hospitals, represents perhaps the darkest chapter in this already horrifying story. Patients suffering from what we now recognize as depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, or other psychological conditions were viewed as being possessed by demons or punished by God for their sins. The treatments prescribed for these unfortunate souls were nothing short of torture disguised as medicine. Mental patients were routinely chained to walls or locked in small windowless cells where they would be left for days or weeks at a time. The theory was that physical restraint would prevent the demons from using the patient's body to cause harm to others. These chains were often so tight that they cut into the skin, causing infections and permanent scarring. Patients would be forced to lie in their own waste, unable to move or care for themselves in any way. The exorcism rituals performed on mental patients were elaborate affairs that could last for hours or even days. Priests would chant prayers while applying hot irons to the patient's skin, believing that the pain would drive out evil spirits. holy water mixed with various toxic substances would be forced down patients' throats, often causing severe poisoning. Some patients were beaten with blessed rods or whips until they lost consciousness, with the idea that physical punishment would make their bodies uninhabitable for demons. Starvation was another common treatment for mental illness, based on the belief that demons needed to feed on the patient's physical strength. Mental patients would be given minimal food and water for weeks at a time, weakening them to the point where they could barely stand or speak. This malnutrition often caused permanent brain damage, creating additional mental symptoms that physicians would interpret as evidence that more aggressive treatment was needed. Ice-cold baths were administered to shock patients out of their supposed demonic possession. Patients would be submerged in freezing water for extended periods, sometimes until their lips turned blue and they lost consciousness. The theory was that the extreme cold would be so unpleasant that any self-respecting demon would abandon the body rather than endure such discomfort. Many patients developed hypothermia or pneumonia from these treatments, adding physical illness to their existing mental suffering. The use of restraint devices in medieval hospitals went far beyond simple chains. Patients were strapped into wooden contraptions that held their bodies in painful positions for hours at a time. Some devices were designed to stretch patients' limbs, based on the belief that demons could be physically pulled out of the body. Others compressed patients into small spaces, supposedly squeezing the evil spirits out through natural bodily openings. The spinning chair was a particularly cruel device used to treat mental patients. Victims would be strapped into a chair that was then spun rapidly for extended periods, causing severe dizziness, nausea, and disorientation. The theory was that the spinning motion would confuse the demons and make them abandon their host. In reality, this treatment often caused brain damage from repeated head trauma and internal injuries from violent vomiting. The treatment of epilepsy reveals medieval medicine's complete inability to distinguish between neurological disorders and supernatural possession. Patients suffering from seizures were subjected to some of the most brutal procedures in the medieval medical arsenal. During seizures, metal objects would be forced between patients' teeth to prevent them from biting their tongues, often breaking teeth and causing severe mouth injuries. Between seizures, epileptic patients might be subjected to trepanation, having holes drilled in their skulls while fully conscious to release the demons, supposedly causing their condition. The drilling process could take hours, with patients feeling every turn of the crude metal bit as it ground through their skull bone. Many patients died from the shock and trauma of the procedure itself, while others succumbed to the inevitable brain infections that followed. The medieval understanding of what we now call autism or developmental disabilities was equally primitive and cruel. Children and adults who displayed unusual behaviors or communication patterns were often assumed to be possessed by evil spirits or cursed by God. These patients were subjected to violent exorcisms, forced fasting, and physical punishment designed to drive out whatever supernatural forces were controlling their actions. The treatment of patients with what we would recognize today as post-traumatic stress was based on the assumption that their symptoms were caused by moral weakness rather than psychological trauma. Soldiers returning from battle, with what medieval physicians called melancholia, were treated with bloodletting, purging, and various herbal concoctions designed to restore their moral courage. The idea that witnessing violence and death could cause lasting psychological damage was completely foreign to medieval medical thinking. Sleep disorders were attributed to demonic visitation during the night hours. Patients who suffered from insomnia or nightmares were believed to be receiving visits from evil spirits while they slept. The treatment involved keeping patients awake for days at a time to prevent these supernatural encounters, often causing severe sleep deprivation that worsened their original symptoms and created new psychological problems. The medieval approach to treating what we now understand as addiction was equally misguided and harmful. Patients who drank too much alcohol or used other substances were viewed as morally weak individuals who had surrendered their souls to demonic influences. Treatment involved forced abstinence combined with physical punishment, prayer, and various toxic herbal remedies that were supposed to purge the body of evil influences. The understanding of female mental health was particularly warped by medieval attitudes toward women and sexuality. Any woman who displayed behavior that men found threatening or unusual was likely to be diagnosed with hysteria and subjected to invasive gynecological procedures. These treatments were based on the belief that mental symptoms in women were caused by problems with their reproductive organs, rather than their brains. Women who refused to marry or have children were often forced into hospitals where they would be subjected to procedures designed to correct their supposedly abnormal desires. Hot irons might be applied to their genital areas, or foreign objects inserted into their bodies to stimulate what physicians believed were dormant maternal instincts. The pain and trauma from these procedures often caused genuine mental illness in women who had originally been perfectly healthy. The treatment of patients with eating disorders reveals medieval medicine's complete lack of understanding about the relationship between mind and body. Patients who refused to eat were assumed to be possessed by demons that were preventing them from accepting God's gifts of sustenance. Force-feeding was the standard treatment, with tubes made from animal intestines being forced down patients' throats while they were held down by multiple attendants. The feeding tubes themselves were sources of infection and injury, often causing tears in the esophagus or stomach lining. The substances forced into patients' stomachs included not just food, but various herbal concoctions and blessed oils that were supposed to drive out the demons preventing normal appetite. Many patients died from complications of force-feeding rather than from their original eating difficulties. Medieval hospitals also housed patients with what we would now recognize as dementia or Alzheimer's disease. These elderly individuals, confused and frightened by their deteriorating mental faculties, were often assumed to be losing their souls to Satan as they approached death. Rather than providing comfort and care, hospital staff would subject these vulnerable patients to exorcism rituals and other traumatic procedures that only increased their confusion and distress. The concept of palliative care for dying patients was completely absent from medieval medical practice. Instead of focusing on comfort and pain relief for terminally ill patients, physicians would continue to apply aggressive treatments right up until the moment of death. Dying patients might be bled, purged, or subjected to painful procedures, even when it was obvious that recovery was impossible. The psychological torture inflicted by medieval medical practices extended beyond the treatments themselves to the way patients were housed and cared for. Mental patients were often displayed to the public like animals in a zoo, with visitors paying small fees to observe their bizarre behaviors and mock their suffering. This public humiliation added another layer of trauma to individuals who were already struggling with serious mental illness. The lack of any understanding about the importance of human dignity in medical care meant that patients were routinely stripped naked and left exposed during examinations and procedures. There was no concept of privacy or modesty, and patients were expected to endure intimate medical procedures while surrounded by crowds of observers, students, and curious onlookers who had no medical reason to be present. The religious framework that dominated medieval medicine created additional psychological burdens for patients who were already suffering from physical ailments. Patients were constantly reminded that their illness was punishment for their sins, creating feelings of guilt and shame that interfered with any possibility of psychological healing. Rather than receiving compassion and support during their time of greatest vulnerability, patients were made to feel that their suffering was deserved, and that recovery would only come through spiritual redemption. The combination of physical pain, psychological trauma, and spiritual guilt created a perfect storm of human suffering that went far beyond what the original diseases would have caused. Medieval hospitals didn't just fail to heal their patients, they actively inflicted additional layers of trauma that made recovery virtually impossible, even for those who might have survived their original ailments with proper care. The medieval period represents a unique chapter in human history where organized medicine actually made people sicker rather than helping them recover. The institutions that were supposed to provide healing instead became factories for producing human misery on an industrial scale. The legacy of these practices would haunt medical care for centuries to come, creating traditions of medical authority and patient powerlessness that would take generations to overcome. Looking back at medieval hospitals from our modern perspective, it's difficult to comprehend how systems ostensibly designed to help people could have become so thoroughly perverted into instruments of torture and death. Yet these institutions operated for centuries, supported by religious authorities, funded by wealthy donors, and staffed by people who genuinely believed they were doing God's work. The horror of medieval hospitals wasn't just in their primitive medical knowledge or crude surgical techniques. It was in their complete dehumanization of patients, who were treated as vessels for demons, punishment cases for divine justice, or simply inconvenient burdens to be managed until death provided relief. The very concept of the patient as a human being deserving of compassion, dignity, and effective care was absent from medieval medical thinking. This systematic dehumanization allowed medieval medical practitioners to inflict unimaginable suffering on their patients while maintaining the belief that they were performing acts of Christian charity. The disconnect between intention and outcome in medieval medicine represents one of history's most tragic examples of how good intentions, combined with ignorance and unchecked authority, can create systems of institutionalized cruelty that persist for centuries. The patients who entered medieval hospitals carried with them not just physical ailments, but hopes for healing, fears about their futures, and the natural human desire to survive and return to their families. What they encountered instead was a nightmare world where their suffering was multiplied rather than alleviated, where their humanity was denied rather than acknowledged, and where their deaths were hastened rather than prevented. These weren't isolated incidents of medical malpractice or occasional failures of an otherwise functional system. This was the systematic, institutionalized torture of the sick and vulnerable, carried out on a massive scale across medieval Europe for hundreds of years. The fact that these practices were conducted in the name of healing and Christian charity only adds to their profound moral horror. The legacy of medieval hospitals reminds us that medical knowledge and good intentions are not enough to create effective healthcare systems. Without scientific methodology, evidence-based practice, and most importantly, genuine respect for human dignity, even the most well-funded and widely supported medical institutions can become sources of suffering rather than healing. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this medieval medical nightmare is how normalized it all became. For generations, people accepted that hospitals were places where you went to die horribly rather than to get better. Families said goodbye to loved ones at hospital doors, knowing they would likely never see them alive again. This acceptance of medical futility and suffering became so deeply ingrained in medieval culture that alternatives were literally unthinkable. The transformation from these medieval houses of horror to modern hospitals represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, built on centuries of scientific advancement, ethical development, and hard-won respect for human dignity. Yet the shadow of medieval medicine still haunts modern healthcare, reminding us how quickly good intentions can turn into systematic cruelty when combined with ignorance, unchecked authority, and the dehumanization of patients. The next time you visit a modern hospital, with its clean rooms, trained staff, effective medications, and focus on patient comfort and recovery, take a moment to remember the countless souls who suffered and died in those medieval chambers of horror. Their pain was not meaningless if it teaches us to never again accept medical systems that prioritize anything above the fundamental goal of healing human suffering with compassion, dignity, and scientific rigor. The medieval understanding of anatomy was so fundamentally flawed that physicians would literally argue about how many teeth humans were supposed to have, despite having countless opportunities to simply look inside patients' mouths and count them. This wasn't just academic ignorance, this was willful blindness to observable reality, and it killed people on a daily basis. Medieval doctors clung to ancient texts with religious fervor, treating the writings of long-dead Greek and Roman physicians as gospel truth that couldn't be questioned or verified through direct observation. The dissection of human bodies was forbidden by church authorities, which meant that medical students learned anatomy from books filled with illustrations that bore no resemblance to actual human organs. When they finally encountered real bodies during medical practice, they would often refuse to believe what they were seeing, insisting that the patient's anatomy was somehow abnormal rather than accepting that their textbooks were wrong. This stubborn adherence to ancient authority over direct observation created a medical system where doctors would perform procedures based on anatomical assumptions that were completely incorrect. Surgeons would cut into patients expecting to find organs in locations where they simply didn't exist, or they would avoid certain procedures because their textbooks warned of blood vessels that weren't actually present in human bodies. The medieval understanding of blood circulation was equally divorced from reality. Physicians believed that blood was consumed by the body like fuel and needed to be constantly replenished through food and drink. They had no concept of the heart as a pump or of blood circulating throughout the body. Instead, they thought blood simply flowed from the liver to various organs where it was used up and disappeared. This fundamental misunderstanding of circulation made bloodletting seem like a logical treatment for almost any ailment. If blood was just consumed by the body anyway, removing some of it couldn't possibly cause harm. The fact that patients often became weaker and sicker after bloodletting was attributed to the treatment working properly, purging corrupt humours from their systems, rather than to the obvious reality that draining blood from sick people was making them sicker. The concept of the nervous system was completely absent from medieval medical thinking. Physicians had no understanding of how the brain controlled bodily functions, or how nerves transmitted sensations and commands throughout the body. They believed that thoughts and emotions originated in various organs, with the heart being responsible for courage, the liver for anger, and the spleen for melancholy. This ignorance about neurological function meant that brain injuries were treated with methods that would be laughable if they weren't so tragic. Patients with head trauma might have herbs stuffed into their nostrils to draw out evil vapors, or they might be suspended upside down to allow corrupt blood to drain from their skulls. The idea that brain tissue was delicate and irreplaceable was foreign to medieval physicians, who would drill holes in patients' heads as casually as they would lance a boil. The medieval approach to treating fractures and broken bones reveals another layer of medical incompetence that caused unnecessary suffering for countless patients. Physicians had no understanding of how bones healed or what conditions were necessary for proper repair. Broken limbs might be bound with wooden splints that were either too loose to provide support or so tight that they cut off circulation entirely. The setting of broken bones was often performed days or weeks after the initial injury, when swelling and infection had already begun to complicate the healing process. Patients would endure having their bones rebroken and reset multiple times as physicians attempted to achieve proper alignment through trial and error. Many patients died from infections introduced during these repeated manipulations of their injuries. Compound fractures, where broken bones pierced through the skin, were considered essentially hopeless. Rather than attempting to clean and repair these injuries, physicians would often recommend immediate amputation to prevent the spread of infection. The amputation itself was performed without anesthesia, using crude saws and knives, with patients dying as often from the shock of the procedure as from their original injuries. The treatment of burns in medieval hospitals demonstrates the complete absence of understanding about wound healing and infection control. Patients with severe burns would have various substances applied to their injuries, including animal fat, honey, and human excrement. These treatments were based on ancient theories about balancing hot and cold humours, rather than on any observation of what actually helped burn tissue heal. The pain from burn injuries was considered spiritually beneficial, so patients were often denied even the primitive pain relief methods that were available. They would lie in agony for weeks while their wounds became infected and their bodies slowly succumbed to sepsis. The mortality rate from severe burns in medieval hospitals approached 100%. not because the injuries were necessarily fatal, but because the treatments were so inappropriate and harmful. The medieval understanding of infectious diseases was so backward that physicians would often prescribe treatments that directly contradicted basic hygiene principles. Patients with open wounds might be instructed to expose them to fresh air and sunlight, despite the obvious risk of contamination. Those suffering from respiratory infections would be crowded together in poorly ventilated spaces, where diseases could spread rapidly from person to person. The concept of contagion existed in medieval medical theory, but it was understood in completely wrong terms. Physicians believed that diseases spread through bad air or evil vapors rather than through direct contact between infected individuals. This led to quarantine practices that focused on avoiding certain locations or weather conditions while ignoring the actual routes of disease transmission. The treatment of sexually transmitted diseases reveals medieval medicine's combination of moral judgment and medical incompetence. Patients suffering from syphilis or gonorrhea were often blamed for their conditions and subjected to particularly harsh treatments as punishment for their supposed moral failings. These treatments included applications of mercury, which caused severe poisoning, and cauterization of genital areas with red-hot irons. The lack of understanding about sexually transmitted diseases meant that these conditions often went undiagnosed until they had progressed to advanced stages. Patients might suffer for years with symptoms that could have been treated effectively if medieval physicians had possessed even basic knowledge about these diseases and their transmission patterns. The medieval approach to treating eye diseases and injuries shows how primitive medical understanding could turn minor problems into major disabilities. Cataracts were treated by inserting sharp needles into patients' eyes to push the clouded lenses out of the way. This procedure was performed without any anesthesia or understanding of eye anatomy, often resulting in complete blindness rather than improved vision. Eye infections were treated with various caustic substances that burned healthy tissue along with infected areas. Patients might have their eyelids held open while acids or other chemicals were poured directly onto their eyeballs, causing excruciating pain and permanent damage. The belief that pain was spiritually beneficial meant that patients were expected to endure these treatments without complaint. The treatment of skin conditions in medieval hospitals demonstrates how surface symptoms were often mistaken for the underlying diseases themselves. Patients with rashes or lesions would have the affected areas burned with hot irons or scraped with sharp instruments, removing healthy skin along with the diseased tissue. These treatments often caused scarring and infection that were worse than the original skin problems. Leprosy and other disfiguring skin diseases were treated with particularly barbaric methods, based on the belief that the external symptoms reflected internal moral corruption. Patients might be subjected to repeated scrapings of affected areas, or they might have caustic chemicals applied to burn away diseased tissue. The pain and disfigurement caused by these treatments often exceeded the damage from the original diseases. The medieval understanding of digestive disorders was based on the theory that stomach problems were caused by imbalances in the body's natural heat and moisture. Treatments for indigestion or stomach pain included forcing patients to vomit repeatedly until they brought up blood, or administering powerful laxatives that caused violent diarrhea and dehydration. Patients with serious digestive conditions like intestinal blockages might be given increasingly powerful purgatives in attempts to force their systems to work normally. These treatments often caused additional damage to already compromised digestive systems, turning treatable conditions into fatal complications. The treatment of respiratory conditions reveals medieval medicine's complete lack of understanding about lung function and breathing. Patients with pneumonia or other breathing difficulties might have their chests cut open in attempts to drain corrupt humours from their lungs. These procedures were performed with crude instruments and no understanding of sterile technique, almost invariably leading to fatal infections. Asthma and other chronic breathing conditions were treated with smoke inhalation therapy, where patients would be forced to breathe various burning substances that were supposed to clear their airways. These treatments often made breathing difficulties worse, while adding new respiratory irritants to patients' already compromised systems. The medieval approach to treating kidney and bladder problems shows how little physicians understood about the urinary system and its functions. Kidney stones were treated with violent massage of the lower back, or with the insertion of sharp instruments into the urinary tract to break up blockages. These procedures were performed without anesthesia and often caused severe internal injuries. Bladder infections were treated by inserting various objects into patients' urethras, including metal rods and bundles of herbs. The theory was that these foreign objects would draw out the infection, but in reality, they usually introduced new bacteria and caused additional trauma to delicate urinary tract tissues. The treatment of heart conditions in medieval hospitals was based on the belief that the heart was the source of courage and emotion, rather than a vital organ that pumped blood throughout the body. Patients with chest pain or irregular heartbeats might be subjected to bloodletting from veins near the heart, or they might have hot poultices applied to their chests to restore the organ's natural heat. The complete lack of understanding about cardiac function meant that patients with serious heart conditions received treatments that often made their symptoms worse. The stress and trauma of medieval medical procedures frequently caused heart attacks in patients whose cardiovascular systems were already compromised. The medieval understanding of reproductive health was so distorted by religious and cultural beliefs that medical treatments often caused more harm than the original conditions. Male patients with reproductive problems might have their genital areas subjected to hot and cold treatments designed to restore proper humoral balance, often causing burns and frostbite that led to permanent disability. Female reproductive health was even more poorly understood, with physicians believing that women's bodies were fundamentally flawed versions of male anatomy. This led to treatments for menstrual disorders that involved attempts to correct what were actually normal bodily functions, often causing serious internal injuries and infections. The treatment of joint problems and arthritis shows how medieval physicians confused symptoms with causes, leading to treatments that address surface manifestations while ignoring underlying conditions. Patients with swollen joints might have the affected areas burned or cut open in attempts to release trapped humours, often causing additional damage to already compromised joints. The lack of understanding about inflammation and its role in joint diseases meant that treatments often increased swelling and pain, rather than reducing them. Patients with arthritis might be subjected to violent manipulation of their joints, causing fractures and dislocations that left them permanently disabled. The medieval approach to treating blood disorders was based on the belief that different types of blood had different properties and functions within the body. Patients with anemia might be bled repeatedly to remove corrupt blood, a treatment that obviously made their conditions worse. Those with clotting disorders might have their blood drawn and examined for signs of supernatural influence. The complete absence of understanding about blood chemistry and hematology meant that serious blood disorders went undiagnosed and untreated. Patients might suffer for months or years with conditions that caused fatigue, weakness, and other debilitating symptoms without ever receiving appropriate medical attention. The treatment of liver and spleen disorders reveals medieval medicine's obsession with the theory of humoral balance at the expense of understanding actual organ function. Patients with liver problems might be subjected to hot compresses and caustic applications designed to restore the organ's natural heat, often causing burns and additional liver damage. Spleen disorders were treated with similar methods, based on the belief that the spleen was responsible for producing melancholy and needed to be heated or cooled to restore proper emotional balance. These treatments had no relationship to actual spleen function and often caused complications that were worse than the original conditions. The medieval understanding of hormonal disorders was completely absent, since physicians had no knowledge of the endocrine system or how hormones affected bodily functions. Patients with diabetes, thyroid problems, or other hormonal imbalances were misdiagnosed and treated for completely different conditions, often receiving treatments that made their symptoms worse. The lack of understanding about metabolism and blood sugar meant that diabetic patients might be given sugar-rich foods and drinks as treatments for their weakness and fatigue, accelerating the progression of their disease. Those with thyroid disorders might be subjected to bloodletting or purging that further disrupted their already compromised metabolic systems. The treatment of nutritional deficiencies shows how medieval physicians failed to recognize the connection between diet and health. Patients with scurvy, rickets, or other vitamin deficiency diseases would receive treatments based on humoral theory rather than dietary changes that could have cured their conditions quickly and easily. The medieval diet was already severely limited for most people, and hospital food was often worse than what patients would have eaten at home. Rather than recognizing that poor nutrition was contributing to their patients' illnesses, physicians would often recommend fasting or further dietary restrictions as treatments for weakness and fatigue. The understanding of genetic disorders was completely absent from medieval medicine, since the concept of heredity as it applied to disease was unknown. Patients with inherited conditions might be blamed for their illnesses or subjected to treatments designed to purge their family's sins from their bodies, adding psychological trauma to their existing physical suffering. The lack of understanding about genetics also meant that families with histories of certain diseases received no counseling or guidance about preventing or managing these conditions. Genetic disorders were often attributed to supernatural causes, preventing any rational approach to treatment or prevention. The medieval approach to treating autoimmune disorders demonstrates how physicians could mistake the body's own defense mechanisms for signs of disease. Patients with conditions like rheumatoid arthritis or lupus might be subjected to treatments designed to suppress what were actually their body's attempts to heal themselves, often making their conditions significantly worse. The absence of understanding about immune system function meant that patients with autoimmune conditions were often misdiagnosed with completely different diseases and treated inappropriately. The treatments themselves frequently caused additional immune system dysfunction, creating cascading health problems that were far worse than the original conditions. The treatment of cancer in medieval hospitals reveals the complete helplessness of physicians when faced with diseases they couldn't understand or categorize within their humoral framework. Tumors might be cut out with crude instruments, burned with hot irons, or treated with toxic substances that poisoned patients without affecting their cancers. The lack of understanding about metastasis meant that physicians would often focus on removing visible tumors while ignoring the spread of cancer throughout patients' bodies. Surgical removal of tumors was performed without any concept of clean margins or follow-up care, almost guaranteeing that cancers would return more aggressively than before. The medieval understanding of aging and age-related diseases was based on the belief that elderly people were naturally losing their vital heat and moisture as they approached death. Rather than recognizing that many age-related conditions could be treated or managed, physicians would often simply wait for elderly patients to die while providing minimal care. This fatalistic approach to geriatric medicine meant that elderly patients received substandard care even by medieval standards. They were often housed in the worst sections of hospitals, given the least food and attention, and subjected to fewer treatment attempts than younger patients with similar conditions. The treatment of traumatic injuries in medieval hospitals shows how lack of understanding about shock, blood loss, and wound healing turned survivable accidents into fatal complications. Patients with severe injuries might be subjected to immediate bloodletting to prevent fever, a treatment that often caused fatal blood loss in people who were already hemorrhaging. The absence of understanding about sterile technique meant that wound cleaning often introduced more bacteria than it removed. Injuries that might have healed with proper care became infected and eventually fatal, while patients endured weeks of agony watching their conditions deteriorate despite medical intervention. The medieval approach to treating poisoning reveals how physicians could mistake the symptoms of toxicity for signs of supernatural influence. Patients who had ingested toxic substances might be given additional poisons as treatments, based on the theory that similar substances would neutralize each other within the body. The lack of understanding about antidotes and toxicology meant that poisoning cases were often handled as spiritual rather than medical emergencies. Patients might be subjected to exorcism rituals while their bodies struggled to process deadly toxins, receiving no medical support during the critical period when intervention might have saved their lives. The treatment of sleep disorders and fatigue shows how medieval physicians consistently confuse symptoms with causes, leading to treatments that addressed surface manifestations while ignoring underlying problems. Patients with insomnia might be kept awake for days to exhaust them into sleeping, a treatment that often worsened their conditions and caused additional health problems. The understanding of circadian rhythms and sleep physiology was completely absent from medieval medicine, meaning that sleep disorders were often attributed to moral or spiritual failings rather than medical conditions. Patients received religious counseling and punishment rather than medical treatment for conditions that could have been managed with proper understanding. The medieval approach to treating dizziness and balance problems demonstrates how physicians could mistake neurological symptoms for spiritual possession or humoral imbalance. Patients with inner ear infections or other balance disorders might be spun in chairs or subjected to violent head movements designed to redistribute corrupt humors. These treatments often caused additional neurological damage while failing to address the underlying causes of balance problems. Patients who might have recovered with rest and proper care instead became permanently disabled by medical interventions that were based on completely incorrect theories about brain and ear function. The treatment of speech and hearing disorders reveals medieval medicine's complete lack of understanding about neurological function and sensory processing. Patients with hearing loss might have various substances poured into their ears, including hot oils and caustic chemicals that often caused additional damage to already compromised auditory systems. Speech disorders were often attributed to spiritual problems rather than physical ones, leading to treatments that focused on exorcism and prayer, rather than addressing potential neurological or anatomical causes. Patients with conditions like stroke-related speech problems received no appropriate medical care and were often assumed to be possessed by demons. The medieval understanding of vitamin and mineral deficiencies was completely absent, since the concept of essential nutrients was unknown. Patients with conditions like anemia or bone diseases that could have been cured with proper nutrition instead received treatments based on humoral theory that often made their deficiencies worse. The limited medieval diet, combined with hospital food that was often spoiled or contaminated, meant that many patients developed nutritional deficiencies during their hospital stays, even if they hadn't been malnourished when they arrived. These secondary deficiencies often prove fatal in patients who might have recovered from their original conditions with proper nutrition. The treatment of addiction and substance abuse shows how medieval physicians confused physical dependency with moral weakness, leading to treatments that focused on punishment and spiritual redemption rather than addressing the underlying medical aspects of addiction. Patients might be subjected to violent purging or bloodletting designed to remove corrupt substances from their bodies. The lack of understanding about withdrawal symptoms meant that patients going through detoxification received no medical support during the most dangerous phase of recovery. Many died from complications that could have been prevented with proper medical management of the withdrawal process. The medieval approach to treating chronic pain demonstrates how physicians consistently prioritize their theoretical frameworks over patient comfort and well-being. Patients with ongoing pain conditions might be told that their suffering was spiritually beneficial and that seeking relief showed lack of faith or moral weakness. The absence of effective pain management techniques meant that patients with chronic conditions lived in constant agony without hope of relief. Rather than developing methods to help these patients cope with their pain, medieval medicine often made their suffering worse through inappropriate treatments and moral condemnation. The treatment of coordination and movement disorders reveals medieval medicine's inability to distinguish between neurological conditions and spiritual possession. Patients with conditions like Parkinson's disease or multiple sclerosis might be subjected to exorcism rituals or violent physical manipulation designed to drive out evil spirits. These treatments often caused additional neurological damage while failing to provide any real medical benefit. Patients who might have maintained some functional capacity with proper care, instead, became completely disabled by medical interventions that were based on superstition rather than understanding of neurological function. The medieval understanding of temperature regulation and fever was so fundamentally flawed that treatments often prevented the body's natural healing mechanisms from functioning properly. Patients with fevers might be subjected to extreme cooling treatments that caused hypothermia, or they might be overheated in attempts to burn out their diseases. The lack of understanding about the immune system's role in fighting infection meant that fever was seen as a disease in itself rather than as a symptom of the body's defense mechanisms. Treatments focused on suppressing fever often interfered with the natural healing process and prolonged illnesses that might have resolved more quickly with supportive care. The treatment of swelling and inflammation shows how medieval physicians consistently misunderstood the body's natural responses to injury and infection. Patients with inflammatory conditions might be subjected to treatments designed to increase inflammation, based on the theory that more heat and swelling would help purge corrupt humors from affected areas. These treatments often turned minor inflammatory conditions into serious medical emergencies, while causing unnecessary pain and tissue damage. The absence of anti-inflammatory treatments meant that patients with conditions like arthritis or inflammatory bowel disease suffered constantly from symptoms that could have been managed with proper medical knowledge. The medieval approach to treating weakness and fatigue demonstrates how physicians confuse symptoms with diseases, leading to treatments that address surface manifestations while ignoring underlying causes. Patients who were weak from blood loss might be subjected to additional bloodletting, while those who were fatigued from nutritional deficiencies might be given purging treatments that worsened their malnutrition. The lack of understanding about the relationship between nutrition, rest, and recovery meant that patients often became weaker during their hospital stays rather than stronger. The combination of poor food, inadequate rest, and harmful treatments created a downward spiral that made recovery virtually impossible, even for patients with initially treatable conditions. As we reach this point in our journey through medieval medical horror, it becomes clear that these institutions weren't just failing to heal people. They were actively destroying human lives on an industrial scale. Every aspect of medieval hospital care, from the architectural design to the medical treatments to the basic understanding of human physiology, was fundamentally wrong in ways that maximized human suffering while minimizing any chance of actual healing. But perhaps what's most disturbing about this medieval medical nightmare is how it persisted for centuries without significant challenge or reform. Generations of physicians continued to practice medicine that was obviously harmful, while patients and families continued to seek care from institutions that were more likely to kill them than cure them. The combination of religious authority, medical tradition, and social hierarchy created a system that was virtually immune to criticism or improvement. The systematic dehumanization that characterized medieval hospitals went beyond mere medical incompetence. It represented a fundamental philosophical approach that viewed patients not as individuals deserving compassion and care, but as objects upon which theoretical medical concepts could be tested and religious doctrines could be applied. This dehumanization wasn't accidental or incidental to medieval medical practice. It was built into the very foundation of how these institutions operated and understood their purpose. Patients entering medieval hospitals were immediately stripped of their individual identities and reduced to collections of symptoms that needed to be categorized according to ancient theoretical frameworks. Their personal histories, their families, their hopes and fears, all of this became irrelevant the moment they crossed the threshold into these institutions. What mattered was not who they were as human beings, but how their conditions could be interpreted through the lens of humoral theory and religious doctrine. The intake process itself was designed to break down patients' sense of personal dignity and autonomy. New arrivals would be subjected to humiliating examinations conducted in front of crowds of observers, students, and other patients. Their bodies would be prodded, poked, and discussed as if they were specimens rather than suffering human beings. Any protests or expressions of discomfort would be dismissed as signs of spiritual weakness or demonic influence. The language used to describe patients reveals the depth of this dehumanization. Medical texts from the period refer to patients using terms typically reserved for animals or inanimate objects. They were described as vessels for disease, containers for corrupt humors, or battlegrounds where spiritual forces waged war. The idea that patients might have preferences, concerns, or insights about their own conditions was completely foreign to medieval medical thinking. This objectification extended to every aspect of hospital life. Patients were fed, washed, and treated according to rigid schedules that ignored their individual needs or preferences. Those who were too weak to feed themselves might be left to starve, while others might be force-fed regardless of their ability to digest food. The concept that medical care should be tailored to individual patients' conditions and responses was absent from medieval practice. The physical layout of medieval hospitals reinforced this dehumanizing approach by making privacy and individual dignity impossible. Patients were housed in vast open halls where every moment of their suffering was visible to dozens of other people. There were no private rooms, no curtains around beds, no recognition that sick people might need quiet spaces to rest and recover. Instead, patients became part of a collective spectacle of human misery. The medical procedures performed in these open wards were deliberately public, designed to demonstrate the physician's authority and knowledge rather than to provide effective treatment for individual patients. A surgical procedure might draw crowds of observers who had no medical reason to be present, but who came to witness the dramatic display of medical power. The patient's pain and humiliation became secondary to the educational and social functions of the procedure. The scheduling of medical treatments was based on institutional convenience and theoretical considerations rather than on patients' actual needs or conditions. Bloodletting might be performed on specific days, regardless of whether individual patients would benefit from the procedure. Medications might be administered according to astrological charts, rather than based on patients' symptoms or responses to treatment. This systematic approach to dehumanization was justified through religious and philosophical frameworks that portrayed individual suffering as spiritually beneficial. Patients were told that their pain was purifying their souls and preparing them for the afterlife. Any desire for relief or comfort was characterized as selfish and spiritually dangerous. The worse patients felt, the more their suffering was praised as evidence of divine favor. The economic structure of medieval hospitals further reinforced the dehumanization of patients by treating them as sources of revenue rather than as individuals deserving care. Wealthy patients might purchase better treatment, but even they were subjected to the same theoretical frameworks and harmful procedures that characterized medieval medicine. The difference was not in the quality of medical understanding, but in the comfort level of their accommodations and the attention they received from staff. Poor patients were often used as training subjects for medical students and apprentices, subjected to experimental procedures and treatments that had no basis in established medical knowledge. These experiments were justified as educational opportunities rather than as potentially harmful interventions that could worsen patients' conditions or cause new health problems. The record-keeping practices in medieval hospitals treated patients as anonymous cases rather than as individuals with unique medical histories and social circumstances. Deaths were recorded in aggregate numbers without individual names or specific causes. This statistical approach to human mortality made it easier for medical personnel to ignore the human cost of their practices and to maintain the illusion that their treatments were effective. The religious ceremonies conducted in hospital wards were designed more for the benefit of the institution and its staff than for the patients themselves. Last rites were administered according to hospital schedules rather than based on patients' actual conditions or spiritual needs. These ceremonies served to demonstrate the hospital's piety and religious authority while reinforcing the message that patients were expected to die rather than recover. The training of medical personnel emphasized theoretical knowledge and institutional authority over patient care and compassion. medical students learned to view patients as illustrations of abstract medical principles rather than as suffering human beings who deserved empathy and effective treatment. This educational approach produced physicians who were skilled at reciting ancient texts, but completely incompetent at providing actual medical care. The hierarchical structure within medieval hospitals created additional layers of dehumanization by separating decision-making authority from direct patient contact. Senior physicians who determined treatment protocols rarely interacted with actual patients, while the staff members who provided daily care had no authority to modify treatments based on their observations of patient responses. This separation between authority and observation meant that harmful treatments continued to be prescribed even when their negative effects were obvious to anyone actually caring for patients. The institutional structure made learning from experience virtually impossible, ensuring that the same mistakes were repeated endlessly across generations of medical practice. The architectural design of medieval hospitals reinforced dehumanization through spaces that prioritized institutional efficiency over human comfort and dignity. Patients were housed in environments that resembled warehouses more than healing spaces, with long rows of beds arranged for easy supervision rather than for patient comfort or recovery. The absence of personal space or private areas meant that patients had no refuge from the constant noise, smells, and visual reminders of suffering that surrounded them. They couldn't escape from the awareness that they were part of a mass processing system rather than individuals receiving personalized medical attention. The lighting and ventilation systems in these buildings were designed for architectural impressiveness rather than for creating environments conducive to healing. Patients lay in dim, poorly ventilated spaces that made their physical discomfort worse, while reinforcing the psychological message that their individual well-being was unimportant compared to institutional considerations. The food service in medieval hospitals exemplified the dehumanizing approach to patient care. Meals were prepared and served according to institutional schedules and budget constraints rather than based on patients' nutritional needs or ability to digest food. Patients who were too sick to eat solid food might be given the same meals as those who were recovering, while those with specific dietary needs received no accommodation. The quality of hospital food was often worse than what patients would have eaten at home, even among the poor. Spoiled or contaminated ingredients were routinely used in hospital kitchens because administrators believed that sick people didn't deserve fresh food. This attitude reflected the broader institutional view that patients' comfort and well-being were secondary to cost control and institutional efficiency. The medical equipment and supplies used in medieval hospitals were often shared between patients without any cleaning or sterilization. Surgical instruments would be used on multiple patients in succession, carrying blood and infectious material from one person to another. This practice wasn't just due to ignorance about infection control. It also reflected the institutional view that individual patient safety was less important than operational efficiency. Medications and treatments were often prepared in large batches and administered to multiple patients regardless of their specific conditions or needs. The idea that different patients might require different dosages or formulations was foreign to medieval medical thinking, which emphasized standardized approaches over individualized care. The waste disposal practices in medieval hospitals treated human waste and medical refuse as institutional problems, rather than as matters that could affect individual patients' health and comfort. Chamber pots might be emptied infrequently, creating unsanitary conditions that worsened patients' suffering and increased their risk of infection. Used bandages and surgical materials were often reused on different patients without cleaning, spreading infection and disease throughout the hospital population. This practice wasn't just due to economic constraints. It also reflected the institutional attitude that individual patients' safety was secondary to operational convenience. So there you have it. The horrifying truth about medieval hospitals, places that turned healing into torture and hope into despair. The next time you walk into a modern hospital, remember the countless souls who suffered in those stone chambers of medieval horror. Their pain wasn't meaningless if it reminds us never to accept medical systems that forget the most basic truth, that every patient deserves compassion, dignity, and actual healing.